A glimmer of growth gives the government hope, but the Chancellor can't promise living standards will rise anytime soon. Apart from Germany, we're the only G7 country not to regain the ground lost in the pandemic, but against expectation, GDP has risen by 0.1%.
Can you promise that living standards will be rising by the end of the year?
Well, those things are subject to lots of factors that are not under the direct control of the government.
Well, hesitancy is down to Britain's stubborn inflation problem, the highest in the G7. So how does the Chancellor chart a way forward? Our economics editor Joel is with him in Japan. Also tonight. Crisis on the US-Mexico border, the desperate rush of thousands to cross as COVID laws end. Dan is there. 30 years of pain, the family of murdered 7-year-old Nikki get justice at last.
No way I didn't expect that. And when I heard it, I screamed at the juries, yes.
Out of control, the battle over Scotland's bracken and why farmers are up in arms. And tuning up for Liverpool's big night, the politics, the pressure, the Eurovision parties and even hope of a home winner.
Just around the shops everywhere in Liverpool, everybody's singing the words of her song.
I think she's a really good entry.
Go England, go UK!
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. On paper, some of the margins dictating our living standards appear incredibly fine. Borrowers hit yesterday as interest rates rose 0.25%. Better news today against expectations. The economy grew by 0.1% in 3 months. Tiny numbers with potentially huge consequences. What it all boils down to for people, of course, is whether they have more or less money in their pockets. Too often right now, it is the latter. So when might people feel better off? Well, when Joel asked Chancellor Jeremy Hunt that today, his answer wasn't exactly unequivocal. Could it be by the end of the year? That is, after all, when the PM has pledged to halve inflation by. Hopefully, Mr Hunt replied. Hope won't pay soaring food bills, though, and while some growth is better than none, as the Chancellor met other G7 finance ministers in Japan, unfavourable comparisons with their progress were hard to avoid.
The host country of this year's G7 is suffering a cost of living crisis of its own. People in Japan have watched prices rise faster than their pay for more than a year. The British Chancellor is not the only finance minister trying to raise the living standards of citizens. Weak economic growth doesn't help, but at least the UK has avoided a recession so far.
Well, these are much better figures than anyone would possibly have predicted, even 3 months ago. And that's partly because of what the Governor of the Bank of England said yesterday, measures in the budget that are helping to help companies to recruit, tackle some of the underlying problems in the economy. But there is still much work to do.
The UK economy contracted by 0.3% in March as car and retail sales fell and the services sector went into reverse. But between the last 3 months of last year and the first 3 months of this year, the economy grew by 0.1%, despite ongoing strike action. On this quarterly basis, the UK economy is still not back to the size it was before the pandemic and Brexit 3 years ago. The rest of the G7 countries have regained the ground they lost, with the exception of Germany. The Chancellor insists the UK is not an outlier, that all of the countries he shared a podium with today are suffering from high inflation, and that Brexit is not holding our economy back. Here's the key question. When will people in the UK start feeling better off again?
As soon as we get inflation down and the increases in people's salaries are not eaten up by the evil of inflation, that's when people will start to feel better, and that's why it's our number one priority to bring inflation down.
You have made a promise to halve inflation by the end of the year. Can you promise that living standards will be rising by the end of the year?
Well, those things are subject to lots of factors that are not under the direct control of the government.
The local election results last week were dire for your party. Do you think people blame the Conservatives for the fact that they feel poorer?
That may be what some people do. Everyone has different motives in elections. We've been in power
Would it be
for
fair
some
to blame the government?
I think if you look at the global economic situation, if you look at the challenges facing France or Italy or Japan, everyone is facing this global shock because of what Putin did in Ukraine.
The Chancellor does have a plan to revive prosperity. He says he wants to turn the UK into the next Silicon Valley. But 2 weeks ago, the president of Microsoft said the European Union is currently a more attractive place to start a business than the UK. Jeremy Hunt is undeterred.
Well, Microsoft were cross because our independent competition regulator made a decision they didn't like, said that they couldn't buy a company that they wanted to buy. But another of the biggest tech companies on the planet, Google, said about a week earlier that they were going to centre their global R&D into artificial intelligence in London.
Like Japan, the UK is a big importer of energy. Like Japan, our workforce is smaller than it used to be. There are reasons why our economy still feels stuck in a low gear. But if we are to improve living standards, we need to find a way to raise growth. Joel Hills, News at 10, Niigata.
And Joel's still in Japan, as you can see, and joins us from there now. Good morning to you, Joel. Well, the Chancellor said to you that everyone's in the same boat, but it doesn't seem as simple as that when you look at the figures within the G7. Why is that?
Well, look, the G7, Julie, here in Niigata is a reminder that the Chancellor is absolutely right when he says all advanced economies are struggling with low economic growth and high inflation of some variety. But currently, as it stands, it does look like the bout of stagflation that the UK faces is a little bit worse than everywhere else. Why might that be? Well, we've had the same problems the United States has had with people leaving the workforce in recent years, either through ill health or retirement. We've also had all the problems that European countries like Germany, France and Italy have had with brutally high energy and food prices. And of course, we face one thing that those countries haven't. We've had Brexit to contend with. The Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OECD, the International Monetary Fund all believe that Brexit has crushed business investment, that it's damaged trade and pushed up prices at the margins. The Chancellor absolutely insistent there's no evidence that Brexit is a drag on economic growth. Now, there are reasons to be optimistic about going forward. The economy has proved resilient, hasn't it? A recession has been avoided. Energy and food prices look as if they might be starting to finally come down, and we will feel that at some point. But inflation more broadly does look pretty stubbornly high. And of course, we've got a situation that interest rates are rising fast. Little wonder then that the Chancellor is reluctant to commit to when we are actually going to start feeling better off again. But governments, let's be clear, that don't raise living standards do run into trouble.
OK, Joel, thanks for taking us through all of that. Thank you. Well, the economy would likely have grown more in those first 3 months of the year had it not been hit by strikes across multiple sectors. The latest addition to the timetable of industrial action has seen rail services affected once again. Train drivers with the ASLEF union went on strike today. RMT members will do so tomorrow, all of which is having a knock-on effect on thousands of fans making their way to Eurovision in Liverpool, determined to get there any way they can.
It was meant to be the welcome mat for tens of thousands of Eurovision visitors. But on Liverpool's big weekend, its biggest station was virtually deserted. Strike action cancelling almost every train.
And we are off. Liverpool, here we come.
Emma Hudson from Sussex was one of many forced to find an alternative means of transport. An 8-hour overnight coach arriving early this morning.
It's been a huge stress because being in Liverpool for this weekend has been a real bucket list item of mine for a very, very long time. And yeah, for a long while, the idea that it might not happen really did get me down. I just wish it hadn't been this weekend.
ASLEF denies targeting Eurovision as train drivers walked out again in their long-running dispute with train companies. Talks over pay and working practices have broken down after a 4% rise was rejected last month.
We're 4 years into this, 4 years without a pay rise. The people behind me don't want to be on strike. They don't want to be losing money. They have families. They've got people who want to go to Eurovision.
But the government condemned the union leadership as services at 16 train companies came to a standstill.
I'm really disappointed that the fair and reasonable pay offer that we facilitated in the Department for Transport is not being put to the members of the trade unions. Where similar offers have been put to members, they've accepted them.
But even among those taking the slow road to Liverpool, there was solidarity with those on strike.
Liverpool is hosting like an international event. It was not the best occasion to take a strike, but we understand.
We'd have got here anyway. I mean, I support the strikers if they, they need to do what they need to do. If it means a mild inconvenience for us to get a bus, it's what it is.
But that inconvenience will continue into the weekend. In a separate dispute, members of the RMT union across 14 train companies will walk out tomorrow, the day of the Eurovision final itself. Train drivers also have 2 more strikes planned, including the day of the FA Cup final. So this won't be the last big headache for travellers trying to get to a major event. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Liverpool.
Now, just as it is in Westminster, tackling illegal immigration is a hot political issue in Washington. Now, on the border between the US and Mexico, around 60,000 people are waiting to cross north. The swelling crowds the result of a changing policy, creating a new headache for President Biden in a long-running crisis. Well, the COVID-era border policy introduced by Donald Trump, known as Title 42, expired overnight. Aimed at stopping new infections of the virus, it allowed the US to swiftly deport any new arrivals without an asylum hearing. Now, just like in 2016, when Donald Trump's promise to build a border wall helped propel him to the White House, immigration is sure to be at the heart of next year's presidential election.
The United States was built on immigration, yet here, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free are finding America's promise of liberty remains walled off. The rules of the immigration game are changing, but the dream of a new life endures. Each person has a story of hardship. Each views this border as salvation. This family is too scared to be identified, having fled death threats from Marxist rebels in Colombia. The mother, who is a nurse, was kidnapped, tortured, and given 2 days to leave the country. Her husband sums up their dilemma.
Es más fácil arriesgar la vida acá que esperar allá que nos maten.
Better to risk our lives here, he says, than stay there and wait for them to kill us. As they cross the Rio Grande, they enter a no man's land, the wrong side of the wall, but technically a few footsteps into the United States.
Porque la situación es muy dura y...
This man says it's tough. There are too many armed groups in Colombia. He's been stuck by the wall for 6 days. A Trump-era rule called Title 42 meant migrants were summarily turned back unless they had a clear asylum claim. Now that's been scrapped, replaced with more complex rules, meaning migrants have to lodge their case online before they get here on an app most can't access. There's jubilation as the first handful of migrants are admitted through Gate 42, hours before Title 42 is scrapped. Most have travelled for months or years to reach this point, but now they must dump everything they own before they are processed. They hope this is a short walk to freedom, but some are already cuffed as they cross to the American side, and they know they might not be here for long.
For those on the other side, this isn't just a gap in the fence, it represents a gateway to a new life. Those crossing from today face complex new rules which will probably mean they'll be immediately deported back where they came from.
Outside the Church of the Sacred Heart in El Paso, migrants' faith in the system is already being tested. They got in before the rule change, but now must wait years for their cases to be heard. Dian says he left economic collapse in Venezuela in 2016. It's taken him since then to walk and hitch through half a dozen countries. Like most here, his stomach and pockets are empty. He says a change in the law doesn't matter if you haven't had anything for breakfast. Most migrants are confused by the new rules. Those helping them think the repeated changes haven't helped.
We've had a series of policies that have intentionally kept people outside of the United States, and so they've created this, quote-unquote crisis in a lot of ways. And so my hope is by returning to the policies of before that we won't see these huge backlogs of people that are just stuck trying to enter the country.
Some Republicans think tougher rules should be put in place to stop what they feel is a migrant invasion. Some Democrats might prefer a kinder immigration system. But what is clear is the border is under pressure like never before, facing vast numbers who believe beyond this wall lies the American dream. Dan Rivers, News at 10, El Paso.
Here, it's taken more than 3 decades since her life was brutally ended, but today 7-year-old Nikki Allen's family finally saw justice done. In October 1992, neighbour David Boyd led her to a derelict building near her home in Sunderland and murdered her. Nikki's body was discovered in the basement. DNA advances meant her killer was finally caught, and after so many years of uncertainty, today's verdict was an emotional moment for the little girl's family.
This is the worst injustice.
This is what 30 years of agony, of no answers for the mother of a murdered 7-year-old finally coming to an end looks like. It's 3 decades since Nikki Allen was lured to her death, stabbed 37 times and hit with a brick. Her body was dumped in this disused warehouse not far from her home. The court heard like a bag of rubbish. This is a knock at the door David Boyd had avoided for 3 decades.
I'm arresting you on suspicion, OK, of that offence.
David Boyd hid his crime, lying about his involvement and prolonging the family's suffering, knowing all along that he had taken the life of their little girl.
Nikki was walking across this courtyard from her grandparents' flat to home, but she never made it. David was known to Nikki's family. He lived just 3 doors down from her grandparents. He thought he'd got away with her brutal murder until now, 30 years later, and it took a jury just 2 hours to return a verdict of guilty.
I feel like I've won the lottery. Yes, yes!
I've won the lottery.
Were you expecting it so quickly today?
Nah, I got shocked my life. No way, I didn't expect that. And when I heard it, I screamed at the juries, yes.
Police say this grainy CCTV shows Nikki's final moments, following a man and skipping to her death. In the decades that passed, new forensic tests were developed. It led to the questioning of David Boyd after the police looked again at the case. Hundreds of men were asked to give DNA samples, and all but the convicted child abuser were ruled out. His DNA was found on the little girl's clothes.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every resident who provided us with their DNA. Without their help, today's conviction would not have been possible.
Nikki would be 37 now. She never got the chance to grow up because of this man. David Boyd will be sentenced later this month, while her family come to terms with the fact that their wait for justice has finally come to an end. Kelly Foran, News at 10.
The publisher of the Mirror newspaper began putting forward its case today as it defends itself against accusations made by Prince Harry and other celebrities of phone hacking and blagging information to get stories. Lawyers for Mirror Group newspapers said there was no evidence of voicemail interception. They also said that in many cases, private investigators and freelance journalists had got information by searching publicly accessible material. Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan has been released on bail for 2 weeks. Having been arrested on Tuesday on corruption charges, the country's Supreme Court ruled yesterday that his detention was unlawful. There were violent scenes across Pakistan following Khan's arrest, with at least 10 people killed. The former cricketer left court today, surrounded by security, and telling reporters that the judiciary was Pakistan's only protection against the law of the jungle. Now, the struggle for power in Turkey could reach its conclusion this weekend, and given the country's political and strategic significance, it's an election being closely watched around the world. Having previously seemed untouchable, the combination of criticism following February's devastating earthquake and a crippling inflation rate, which peaked at 85% in October, have left President Erdogan vulnerable. He's led the country as either Prime Minister or President for more than 2 decades, but he now faces a serious challenge. Sunday's election is essentially a 2-horse race, with former civil servant Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu uniting the opposition to give himself a real chance of victory. To win, the candidates need more than 50% of the vote. If no one achieves that, the contest goes to a runoff.
Always at a geographical crossroads, Turkey now finds itself at a political one as well. The choice is a return to democracy or more autocracy. During his 2 decades in power, President Erdogan has transformed the country into something resembling a dictatorship. After the failed coup of 2016, tens of thousands of his opponents were jailed and the free press eviscerated. His desire to re-establish the days of Ottoman glory found expression in things like the conversion of Istanbul's magnificent Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque. This burnished Erdogan's image as an Islamic strongman, but was a blow to Turkish secularism. Initially, he enjoyed economic success. However, today Turkey is struggling and rampant inflation is undermining Erdogan's authority.
Yola devam diyor muyuz?
But while the polls have him slightly behind, he remains a ruthless operator.
He is, whether one likes him or not, he's a formidable politician and certainly a formidable campaigner, and does not mind using all the power available to him because of the office he holds.
Erdogan's challenger is a former civil servant called Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Nicknamed the Turkish Gandhi, he's promising the restoration of the parliamentary system. He also says he wants to foster better relations with the West, which have suffered under Erdogan. But it's domestic issues that will decide this election. When he came to power, the challenger Erdogan benefited from public anger over shoddy building practices exposed by the 1999 earthquake southeast of Istanbul. Today there's similar anger among the millions affected by February's devastating quake in southern Turkey. If history repeats itself by ousting Erdogan, it will be a seismic shift in Turkish politics. John Irvine, News at 10.
Now, he's only owned the company for a little more than 6 months, but today Elon Musk announced who he's chosen as Twitter's new chief executive. Mr. Musk tweeted, of course, that Linda Yaccarino, formerly an advertising exec at NBC Universal, would be joining the company. She'll be tasked with running the business, while the billionaire will become Twitter's executive chairman and chief technology officer, focusing on new product design and new technology. Mr. Musk's brief period at the social media company has been a tumultuous one so far, to say the least. Back here now, and on frosty winter mornings, the sight of a solitary stag crunching a path through the bracken is a photographer's dream. With summer around the corner, though, farmers in Scotland fear the plant causing a nightmare scenario. The Scottish Government has delayed ordering a chemical used to keep the spread of bracken under control. And with time running out to get hold of supplies, there are concerns about the potential risks to wildlife and humans.
The brown patches on this hillside farm are bracken, a common fern you'll also find in woodland and moorland.
You see all the bracken growing here. I mean, this causes concern in terms of the area that livestock have to forage.
It's an issue facing farmers as it grows quickly, and a herbicide used each year to control it now requires devolved government approval. But that hasn't yet happened.
It has a huge effect on animal welfare. There's lots of it's ticks and tick-borne diseases. Politics really need to be set aside. It needs to be the realism of what's actually happening on the ground here.
Time is running out. Already the new bracken shoots are coming through.
Well, when they're fully grown, they'll be up to this sort of height and much thicker. So these are just the early shoots.
But the chemical has to be imported from India once approved and licences granted for aerial spraying.
Why can we not move away from the sprinklership and have a longer term approval so we're not facing this sort of precipice this time every year when everyone wakes up to the fact we might have a problem with bracken?
The spread of the fern has been linked to an increase in tick numbers, and campaigners warn this could see a jump in illnesses such as Lyme disease.
So the symptoms were the bullseye rash, the flu-like symptoms and joint pain. The ticks that you're getting bit by are as small as a poppy seed. It's really, really important to be checking yourself every time you've been outside.
The devolved nations are awaiting the Health and Safety Executive's guidance. They've told us that will happen soon. But for landowners, the longer they wait, the more threatening the bracken becomes.
Louise Scott, News at 10, Dumfries and Galloway.
A week on from King Charles' coronation, a new photograph's been released tonight illustrating the future of the monarchy. It shows the newly crowned king in full regalia sitting in Buckingham Palace's throne room with his two heirs beside him. His eldest son, the Prince of Wales, stands to his right and his grandson, Prince George, to the left. An image of today's king and the two due to follow in his footsteps one day. And finally, for those waiting to find out who will be crowned this year's Eurovision champion, the final is less than 24 hours away. 6,000 people in the arena and millions watching will be making their mind up on their favourite act. One voice they won't hear is that of Ukraine's President Zelensky. His request to speak has been turned down. Not to be distracted by politics, though, the 26 finalists have been tuning up and thousands of fans turning up in Liverpool, where they're good to go.
A dress rehearsal earlier today, and how else to start proceedings than with last year's winners Kalush Orchestra. But it was the prospect of this year being won by the UK's Main Muller that excited fans arriving for tonight's run-through.
Just around the shops everywhere in Liverpool, everybody's singing the words of her songs. So it's quite a simple song, but it is really easy to pick up the words and sing along.
She's just got real stage presence. She takes the crowd along with you. I think she's a really good entry. Catchy song. I mean, what's there not to love?
Go UK!
Like all the contestants, May Muller has been rehearsing hard this week in preparation for tomorrow's grand final.
The rehearsals for sure made everything kind of like click. It will be the biggest show that I've ever done, obviously, so it looks great. And yeah, I'm even more, I thought I was pumped before, but now I'm like, we're ready to go.
26 acts will be appearing on that stage at tomorrow night's grand final. Someone who won't be appearing is President Zelensky. He had made a request to make some form of address during the show. This has been turned down by the EBU, which runs the Eurovision Song Contest. Amongst those left disappointed is the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak says the Ukrainian president should be allowed to speak. The Labour leader Keir Starmer agrees. But the EBU says it would break their rules on political impartiality. Today, Graham Norton, one of the show's hosts, was asked about the ruling.
As far as I know, that's an EBU decision. And as you know, the EBU, they rule with an iron fist. So what they say goes.
Not that there won't be any politics. Croatia's entry, an anti-war song which the performers say takes aim at Vladimir Putin. The bookies don't expect it to trouble the top of the leaderboard. The favourite remains Sweden. Loreen, a previous winner, continues to be tipped to come out top. With Ukraine's entry to Vorchi amongst the finalists. Tonight, the juries for each country have been voting. Tomorrow, the viewing public gets its chance to decide who gets the Eurovision crown this year. Nina Nannar, News at 10 in Liverpool.
Everything crossed here for May, of course. That is it for tonight from all the team here. Thanks for staying up. Have a great weekend. Good night.